Real nightmares.
Mark stepped into the sleek dining room of the Last Table, the newest restaurant in the city. Polished surfaces gleamed under dim, ethereal lights, and the place exuded an air of quiet luxury. The muted tones and minimalist decor gave it an almost otherworldly atmosphere. Too clean, too precise, as if it wasn't meant for everyday life. Despite this, Mark couldn't shake a gnawing feeling in his gut. He chalked it up to first-day jitters. After months of job hopping and struggling to make rent, this opportunity seemed like a fresh start. The manager, a stiff man in an immaculate suit, had barely interviewed him before offering the position, claiming they needed someone right away. Mark figured it was a stroke of luck. His gaze lingered on a peculiar sight. A single table in the center of the dining room, set impeccably for one. No one approached it. The staff moved around the room with purpose, setting other tables, but they seemed to give that one a wide berth. "What's with that table?" Mark asked a fellow waiter, a pale woman who had been there since the restaurant opened. She glanced at him, her eyes hollow. "You'll see." Mark's second week at the Last Table passed in a blur. The restaurant attracted a constant stream of patrons, well-dressed, quiet, and curiously detached. But Mark couldn't shake the lingering strangeness surrounding the last table in the center of the room, always set for one but never occupied. That changed on a particularly cold, still evening. "Tonight, you're serving the last table," the manager said, handing Mark the order ticket. No explanation, no instructions, just a cryptic nod, as if that alone carried the weight of the task. Mark approached the table cautiously, heart pounding. The customer, a lone man in an immaculate suit, arrived without a sound. His pale skin was stretched tight over his face, his hollow eyes looking through Mark as he sat. The man's presence was unnerving, like a shadow that had taken form. Mark handed him the menu, but the man didn't glance at it. "I already know what I'm having," the man rasped, his voice low and brittle. "My final meal." Mark stiffened, unsure how to respond. He took the man's order, though his hands shook as he scribbled it down. Throughout the meal, Mark noticed something disturbing. With each bite, the man seemed to age. His cheeks hollowed, his hair grayed, and his hands, once steady, began to tremble. By the time dessert was served, the man was almost skeletal, his head slumped forward, eyes sunken in darkness. When Mark alerted the manager, he was met with chilling indifference. "It's handled. Go home." Mark couldn't shake the feeling of dread that followed him home that night. He lay awake, replaying the evening in his mind. The man's hollow face, the eerie calm of the staff, and the way the manager had dismissed it all without a second thought. Sleep, when it finally came, was fitful, filled with murky, unsettling dreams of withering faces and fading voices. Back at the last table the next evening, things felt even more off. The restaurant was as pristine as ever, but a suffocating heaviness hung in the air, pressing down on Mark. His eyes drifted back to the last table, now reset as though nothing had happened. But it had. He was sure of it, and yet no one acknowledged it. His colleagues remained tight-lipped, their faces carefully neutral, as though they were avoiding something too terrible to name. As the night wore on, Mark swore he heard something faint, a whisper. At first, he thought it was a customer speaking softly, but when he moved closer, there was no one nearby. It wasn't coming from the tables or the staff. It was coming from the last table. Mark paused in his tracks, listening harder. The whispers grew more distinct, fragmented sentences that sounded like pleas. He strained to hear, but the words slipped away, like echoes of voices long forgotten. Shaken, Mark began digging through the restaurant's records after his shift. But no matter how much he searched, there were no records of the strange man from the night before. Mark couldn't let go of what he had seen or heard. The whispers seemed to follow him, even beyond the restaurant. When he wasn't on shift, they echoed in his head, faint and persistent. He knew something was terribly wrong with the last table, but the silence of the staff and the vanishing records only deepened the mystery. Desperate for answers, he sought out the head chef, the one figure in the restaurant who seemed to hold real authority. Late one night, after the last customers had left, Mark found the chef lingering near the kitchen. The man had an air of control about him, as if nothing inside the restaurant was beyond his grasp. "I need to know what's going on," Mark said, his voice barely steady. "The last table. What is it?" The chef regarded him with a slow, measured look, then finally spoke. "You've noticed, haven't you? What happens to those who dine there?" Mark swallowed hard, nodding. The chef motioned for him to sit, and with a grim expression, he began to explain. "The last table, it's not a regular seat. It's a feeding ground. The restaurant feeds on the souls of those who sit there. You see, this place draws people with unfinished business, regrets, unresolved guilt, desires they can't let go of. The table offers them one final meal, tied to their deepest cravings. But in return, it takes everything from them. Their life, their soul." Mark's stomach twisted in horror as the truth sank in. "Why me? Why was I assigned to that table?" The chef's lips curled into a cold smile. "Because you were chosen. Long before you even walked in here. You were meant for this. The table's next meal is you." Mark's breath hitched in his throat. "The next meal is you." The words echoed in his mind, sending a cold shock of fear through his veins. He bolted from the chef's presence, his heart pounding as he made his way toward the exit. But the hallway stretched on endlessly, the doors seeming to drift further away with each step. He broke into a run, panic rising as the restaurant seemed to warp around him. The walls twisted, narrowing, suffocating him as they led him in circles back to the dining room. He stopped, chest heaving, realizing with growing horror that the restaurant wasn't just trapping him, it was alive. A sentient force, feeding off the souls of its victims. And it had him now. The whispers returned, louder this time, filling the air around him. "You can't leave, not yet." Mark's mind raced. He had to escape, but every door led back to the dining room. Every hallway coiled in on itself like a maze. As he stumbled through the endless passageways, his own regrets started to surface, bleeding into his thoughts. His failures, job after job, his constant search for approval, his desperation to escape the mundane life he had lived. It was as though the restaurant was feeding on his very guilt, his deepest regrets. Then, he heard something familiar. His name, spoken softly. He turned. It was his reflection, sitting at the last table. The version of him at the table stared back, eyes hollow, lips cracked into a knowing smile. Mark's heart froze as he realized. The restaurant wasn't just trying to take his life. It was consuming his soul. Frantic, he fought against the pull, his mind wrestling with the overpowering weight of his own failures. He couldn't give in. Mark didn't know how long he had fought, against the restaurant, against himself. But somehow, he had managed to break free. He burst through the front doors of the last table, gasping for air as the cold night hit his face. The whispers finally faded, leaving only an eerie silence in their wake. For the first time in what felt like hours, Mark could think clearly again. He was out. He had escaped. But even as he walked away, the weight of what he'd learned clung to him. The restaurant had let him go, but it hadn't released him. The last table was still connected to him. He could feel it. Every step felt heavier, as if invisible strings still tied him to that cursed place. Was he really free, or just another part of the game? The next morning, as he fumbled through his apartment in a haze, Mark froze at the sight of something on his doorstep. A simple white envelope, the same as the ones used for the restaurant's reservations. His name was printed on the front, and inside, a single card, reservation for one at the last table. His hands trembled. He had escaped, but he knew the truth. You can't run forever. Elliot Ross had driven for hours, the roads growing narrower and the landscape more desolate as he approached the village. The sun had begun to sink behind the hills, casting long shadows over the small, clustered houses that looked as though they hadn't been touched by time or modernization. The village was quiet, eerily so, with only a few locals moving about, their expressions unreadable, their pale faces downturned as he passed. He had come here on a hunch. The disappearance of a fellow critic had been quietly brushed off by authorities, but Elliot wasn't one to let such a mystery go. The missing critic had been last seen visiting a restaurant at the edge of this village, a place famous for its chefs, local ingredients. Elliot was here to uncover the truth, both about the restaurant's acclaimed food and the unsettling whispers surrounding it. His stomach knotted with both curiosity and dread. Elliot stood in front of the restaurant, its warm, flickering lights beckoning him inside. The building had an old-world charm, with wooden beams and ivy crawling up the stone walls. Yet, something about it felt off. The sign hanging above the door simply read, "The Chef's Table," and despite the inviting exterior, the quiet from the village seemed to seep into the restaurant's air as soon as he stepped inside. The diners were there, seated at candlelit tables, but they barely spoke. They ate in silence, their eyes downcast, as if afraid to look around. Elliot felt a chill at the back of his neck, but brushed it off. A waiter greeted him, motioning toward the chef, who stood behind the counter, watching. Gaunt and intense, the chef's eyes gleamed as he approached Elliot. "We pride ourselves on our connection to the land," the chef said with a strange smile. "Everything is local." Elliot was seated at a small, dimly lit table, the chef's cryptic words still echoing in his mind. As he scanned the room, something nagged at him. Small details that didn't fit. A diner 2 tables over wore a wristwatch identical to the one worn by the missing critic in a photograph Elliot had seen. Another guest, pale and thin, twirled a ring on her finger, its stone flashing under the candlelight, eerily familiar. The waiter returned, carrying a single dish on a silver tray. "The chef's special," he whispered, placing it in front of Elliot. The plate looked simple, almost humble, but the aroma was intoxicating. Earthy, rich, with a hint of something sweet, something unfamiliar. Elliot hesitated before taking his first bite. The flavors exploded in his mouth, delicate yet overwhelming. But then came the rush, a wave of emotions not his own. His chest tightened as if invisible hands were squeezing his lungs. Despair flooded his mind, a suffocating sense of fear and hopelessness. He dropped his fork, gasping, his pulse racing. Suddenly, he saw flashes of the missing critic's face, wide-eyed, terrified. The emotions were his. Elliot knew then that something was terribly wrong. Elliot left the restaurant in a daze, his mind swirling with the unshakable sensation that he'd tasted more than just food. The weight of despair still clung to him, like a shadow he couldn't outrun. Back in his hotel room, he couldn't stop thinking about the eerie connection between the dish and the emotions that had flooded him. Determined to get answers, Elliot spent the night scouring local archives. What he uncovered made his blood run cold. Numerous accounts of disappearances, all linked to the restaurant. Locals, travelers, even a few who were passing through, all vanished without a trace after dining at the chef's table. Strangely, as each person disappeared, the restaurant's reputation grew, becoming more famous for its unparalleled cuisine. In the archives, he found an old newspaper clipping with a photo of the missing critic standing beside the chef. Elliot's heart skipped a beat. He now understood that the chef's so-called local ingredients were more sinister than anything he had imagined. It wasn't just that the chef used ingredients from the land. He was using the people who had come through this village, their very essence, cooking them into his dishes. Elliot's horror deepened. He was next. Elliot returned to the restaurant the next day, fear gnawing at him, but his resolve stronger than ever. He demanded to speak with the chef. This time, the chef didn't offer his usual cryptic smile. Instead, he led Elliot through a door behind the kitchen, into a small, dimly lit room that smelled of herbs and something far less pleasant. The walls were lined with shelves, and on each shelf sat rows of glass jars, each filled with a strange, faintly glowing liquid. The chef picked one up, swirling it gently, watching Elliot's reaction. "These," the chef said softly, "are the essence of my finest ingredients, emotions, memories, the soul itself." He placed the jar back on the shelf. "The people who dined here live on through my dishes. Their essence, their experiences, give flavor to every bite." Elliot's stomach turned as the horrifying truth fully sank in. The chef wasn't just cooking food. He was cooking souls. Elliot's hands trembled as he backed away from the shelves of jars. The chef stood between him and the door, his eyes cold and calculating. "Once you've tasted, you become part of the restaurant," the chef murmured, stepping closer. "It's already begun." Elliot could feel it, an invisible tether pulling him toward the jars, toward the kitchen, as if he was being absorbed into the restaurant itself. His breath quickened. The faces of the other diners, the missing critic, flickered in his mind. He had to escape, but the walls felt like they were closing in, trapping him in this nightmare. In a desperate burst of adrenaline, Elliot lunged toward the shelves, grabbing the nearest jar and hurling it to the floor. The glass shattered, and a rush of cold air filled the room, followed by a soft, mournful wail. The chef's expression twisted in fury as Elliot began smashing jar after jar, releasing the trapped souls. The restaurant groaned, its walls seeming to tremble under the weight of the unleashed spirits. Flames erupted from the kitchen as the chef tried to stop Elliot, but it was too late. The souls had been freed, and the restaurant, now alive with chaos, began to burn. Elliot stumbled out of the burning restaurant, smoke and ash swirling behind him. The fire consumed the building, reducing it to embers as the freed souls scattered into the night. But as he gasped for air, a strange emptiness settled inside him. Something was missing, as though the restaurant had taken a piece of him with it. Weeks later, a letter arrived at his door. No return address, just an elegant menu. At the bottom, scrawled in delicate handwriting, was a new dish, Chef's Collection, Elliot Ross. His heart sank. Part of him still belonged to the restaurant, forever trapped in its final meal. The evening air was thick with the scent of city streets as Ethan approached Culinaire, a place he never thought he'd return to. Nestled on a quiet street corner, the restaurant's exterior was elegant, understated, dark wood and warm, glowing lanterns. It was a far cry from the noisy, bustling kitchens Ethan had once called home. Still, beneath the beauty, something felt off, like a flawless facade hiding a deeper rot. Ethan paused at the entrance, staring at the gilded sign with his mentor's name, Chef Anton Villefort. His stomach twisted at the memory of Anton, a man who had once taught him everything about food, discipline, and passion. But the mentor he knew was gone, replaced by this culinary icon whose fame had surged after opening Culinaire. What drew Ethan back wasn't nostalgia, though. It was the whispers, the rumors that Anton's newest creation could evoke memories so powerful they felt real. And for Ethan, a man haunted by the memory of a tragic kitchen accident that had taken a friend's life, the temptation to find closure was too great. Stepping inside, Ethan was greeted by an eerie stillness. Soft music played, but the muted tones felt distant, barely touching the diners seated at pristinely set tables. The restaurant was beautiful, no doubt, but something in the air felt wrong. An unnatural quiet, like the space was holding its breath. A hostess approached with a mechanical smile, and Ethan forced himself forward. Ethan was led to a table near the window, the soft clink of glassware the only sound breaking the unsettling silence. The menu in front of him was sparse, with no clear descriptions, just names like Bittersweet Remembrance and Regret's Delight. He frowned, his stomach knotting with both curiosity and unease. This wasn't Anton's usual style. The first course arrived without ceremony. A small, delicate plate of something that smelled faintly familiar, though he couldn't place it. The waiter, eyes blank and distant, merely nodded as he set it down and disappeared, leaving Ethan alone with the dish. He hesitated, then took a bite. The taste was extraordinary. It wasn't just the flavor, which was exquisite, but the way it triggered something deep within him. A warmth spread through his chest, and suddenly he was no longer in the restaurant. He was 12 again, sitting in his mother's kitchen, sunlight streaming through the window as she baked his favorite cake. He could hear her humming, smell the sweetness in the air. It was all so vivid, too vivid. His fork clattered to the table, snapping him back to reality. His pulse raced as he stared down at the half-eaten dish, his mind spinning. What had just happened? He blinked, trying to shake the memory loose, but it clung to him like a dream that felt too real. The warmth of the memory lingered, but now it was tainted by the growing realization that something wasn't right. Ethan looked around, noticing for the first time how other diners sat unnervingly still, their eyes glazed, as if they too were lost somewhere far away. He wasn't alone in this strange experience, but that brought him no comfort. He couldn't shake the feeling that he was just getting started. Ethan's hands trembled as he pushed his plate aside, the echoes of that haunting memory still swirling in his head. He scanned the room more closely now, taking in the other patrons. A woman at a nearby table sat utterly still, her fork paused mid-air, her eyes wide with unspoken terror. Across the room, an older man seemed lost, tears silently streaming down his face as he stared blankly at his half-eaten meal. Driven by a gnawing sense of dread, Ethan leaned toward the woman beside him. "Are you all right?" he asked quietly. She flinched as if waking from a nightmare, blinking rapidly. "It's just the food," she whispered, her voice shaking. "It brings things back, things I thought I'd forgotten." Before he could ask more, a waiter appeared, his face expressionless. "The next course will be served shortly," the man said, his voice a monotone that made Ethan's skin crawl. He retreated before Ethan could protest. As the woman fell back into silence, Ethan's unease deepened. He needed answers, and only one person could provide them. Determined, he stood and made his way to the kitchen. The back of the restaurant was a sharp contrast to the dining room. Bright lights, bustling activity, the sharp scent of sauces and spices. And at the center of it all, Chef Anton Villefort. He stood tall, orchestrating the staff with smooth, deliberate gestures, as though nothing unusual was happening just beyond the kitchen doors. "Anton," Ethan called out, stepping forward. The chef turned slowly, his expression unreadable. "Well, if it isn't my most promising student," Anton said, a slight smirk playing at his lips. "Come to taste the truth, have you?" The words sent a chill down Ethan's spine. Ethan's jaw tightened at Anton's words, but he forced himself to remain composed. "What's going on here, Anton?" he asked, his voice barely steady. "The food. It's doing something to people." Anton's smirk deepened as he wiped his hands with a pristine towel. "Ah, you always did have an eye for the details, Ethan. But you're not seeing the bigger picture." He stepped closer, his voice lowering to a whisper. "My dishes, they are not merely food. They are conduits, portals to the past, to places buried deep within us. You tasted it, didn't you?" Ethan swallowed hard, the memory of his mother's kitchen still too real in his mind. "You're playing with people's emotions, with their lives," he said, his anger rising. "I don't know how you're doing it, but this isn't right, right?" Anton's voice turned cold, his smile fading. "What is right? I'm giving them something no other meal can offer, truth. A chance to face what they've buried, what they hide from even themselves. But not everyone is strong enough to endure it." A sudden clatter behind them made Ethan turn. One of the waiters was frantically clearing away plates from a diner who appeared catatonic, his gaze empty, mouth slack. Ethan's pulse quickened as he realized that some of these people weren't just experiencing memories, they were trapped in them. "Why are you doing this?" Ethan demanded, his voice tight. Anton shrugged, his face emotionless. "To perfect my craft. The deeper the emotion, the more powerful the dish. But if you can't handle it, you can always leave. Or," he added, his eyes gleaming with dark intent, "you could finish what you started." The next course was already being prepared for him. Ethan's fists clenched at his sides, but he fought to keep his composure. "Finish what I started," he repeated, his voice low. "You mean let you drag me deeper into this nightmare?" Anton raised an eyebrow, his hand still busily plating the next course, as if Ethan's turmoil were merely background noise. "Nightmare? No, Ethan. This is catharsis. Don't you want to face what's been eating at you for all these years? That guilt, gnawing at you? You've been running from it for too long." Ethan shook his head, backing away a step. "You don't understand. What I went through." His words faltered, the memory of the accident rising to the surface again, clearer than ever. The shattering glass, the screams, the smell of burning food mixed with blood. Anton paused, his sharp eyes locking onto Ethan's. "Oh, but I do understand. That's why you need this. You don't just taste my food, you live it. You let it pull those memories out, raw and unfiltered. Only then can you be free. Ethan's gaze shifted to the dining room, where more patrons sat lost in their own private hells. Some wept quietly. Others sat still, as if their souls had been drained from them. He realized with growing horror that they weren't just experiencing memories, they were being consumed by them. Is that what freedom looks like? He asked, his voice trembling. A room full of broken people? Anton smiled faintly. Not all are strong enough. But you might be. Ethan's heart raced, the weight of Anton's words pressing down on him. He wanted to run, to escape this nightmare of a restaurant, but his feet felt anchored to the polished floor. Deep down, he knew Anton was right. He'd been running for years, hiding from the guilt that haunted him every waking moment. But here, now, in this room full of tormented souls, he wasn't sure he wanted to face what lurked in the depths of his own. Anton gestured toward a waiter, who appeared with another plate. The dish was simple yet unnerving, an intricate arrangement of meats and vegetables, all designed to resemble a shattered mirror, a reflection of Ethan's fractured past. This, Anton said softly, is the final course, the one that will pull the memory from you fully, the one that will set you free, if you're strong enough to finish it. Ethan stared at the plate, feeling the pull of the memory just beneath the surface, threatening to overwhelm him. He hesitated, but the need for release, for an end to the guilt, drove him to pick up his fork. His hand trembled as he took the first bite. In an instant, he was back in the kitchen on that fateful night. The smell of burning oil, the sharp crack of glass breaking, the scream that followed. He saw his friend, his colleague, collapsing, blood pooling on the floor. This time, though it was worse, he couldn't look away. He was trapped inside the memory. As the world around him dissolved, Ethan felt the full weight of the past crashing over him. The memory clung to Ethan like a suffocating fog, drowning him in every detail. The heat of the flames, the sickening sound of his friend hitting the floor. His chest tightened as guilt threatened to swallow him whole. But then, as quickly as it came, the memory began to fade, leaving a hollow emptiness in its wake. He gasped, blinking in the dim light of culinaire, his body trembling. Anton watched him, a satisfied gleam in his eyes. "There," he said softly, "you faced it. You're free now." But Ethan didn't feel free. He felt hollow. The guilt was gone, but so was something else, something vital. He looked around the restaurant, seeing the empty shells of other diners who had also lost a part of themselves to Anton's dishes. As new patrons entered, oblivious to the horror within, Ethan sank into his chair, realizing he would never truly leave culinaire.